This is Dying Light 2. The original Dying Light was a game that didn't have an original bone in its body, but did everything well enough to still be a very enjoyable experience. It was sort of the poster child for the idea that you don't always have to innovate, because it was a game that didn't do anything at all new. Its parkour, crafting, zombies, and all that stuff was all kind of passé at the time, by the time that it came out, but it did everything so uncommonly well that it didn't matter, because it was still a really fun experience. So I found it interesting that they actually wanted to make a direct sequel to that, because I guess the real question is that good enough a second time? Is the whole not doing anything new but doing everything well a good idea to do twice? And what it really comes down to for me is a very enjoyable gameplay loop that has some problems in the story department, but we'll get onto more of that in a few. So what exactly is Dying Light 2 for those who have perhaps never actually played the original or have just slept since then? Dying Light is an open world sort of zombie survival experience with a lot of focus on parkour and a bunch of mechanics that allow for high mobility. You're meant to get around the city in all sorts of very organic and nice feeling ways with a pretty punchy first person combat system and all the stuff that you would expect from this sort of genre, and the fact that, of course, at night, zombies get much more dangerous, hordes get much larger, and you have to be very careful about where you go because it's very easy to get overwhelmed. This is actually one of the game's first big improvements, in my opinion, over the first one, because in the first Dying Light, nighttime was pretty easy to just skip, because zombies got so much more dangerous at night, you really didn't want to be out at night most of the time, but the thing is, there wasn't really much that you could only do at night, so for the most part, you didn't have a reason to actually stick around at night, making it sort of like half of a risk-reward system, if you know what I mean. It had the increased risk half, but not so much the increased reward half, unless, of course, you were searching for a bunch of special zombies and could find them easier that way, but for the most part, it was ignorable, you could say. But in Dying Light 2, they've actually gone out of their way to make several different activities you can find that are specifically geared towards you doing them at night, giving you a reason to actually stay up and not just skip it. So you'll be coming across things like the new dark zones, which are interior areas or caves or various bits like that are dark during the daytime, and they're absolutely packed with sleeping zombies in the daylight. So you really don't want to go there in the day because they're just so full of zombies and you'll get very easily overwhelmed. But they also have really good loot. Some of the stuff that you really need to upgrade yourself can be found in these zones. But at night, all the zombies will be out exploring the streets in big hordes, so these areas actually become a lot safer if you can successfully get to them. So that's an example of one of the new nighttime activities that you can find. And there are others as well, like the GRE anomaly areas, which are sort of like big horde encounters / boss fights that you can find in certain areas. And these tend to have some extremely good loot, including things like the military tech that you can pick up, which you need to upgrade your main tools of traversal and stuff. So it's oftentimes pretty important to do these to upgrade yourself, making them actually worthwhile to do, but of course very dangerous because these zombies tend to come in very large hordes in these places with at least one very powerful special zombie that acts as a sort of mini-boss or boss encounter. So yeah, I do like the fact that they've gone out of their way to make the world a little bit more interesting at night. It is very dangerous to be out at night with some of the other things like, say, the howlers that can cause chases if they spot you, but even these can be good because they give you a lot of parkour experience points if you're able to actually escape the horde that's chasing you, which generally involves either getting out of sight and then getting to some sort of hiding place, or finding a UV zone, a zone with a bunch of UV lamps, and actually chilling out there and waiting for the horde to pass you by. So yeah, they've definitely livened up the place a bit at night, giving you a lot more reasons to stick around. But of course the big draw here is the story, because we've heard a whole lot in all the pre-release announcements and things about this story that was going to have a lot of moral choices for you to take part in. And of course, pretty much anyone that's ever played a video game before sees announcements like this as kind of silly, because we all tend to know in advance that every time a game advertises its moral choice system, it's usually very underwhelming compared to how they're making it out to be. Pretty much everyone that sees these announcements is like just expecting it to be nowhere near as detailed as they're saying, and to be a little bit more disappointing in general. And I have to say that this game's moral choice system is kind of a weird beast, because it's actually not bad, and in my opinion the overall story is really not bad, but it has some really weird deficiencies to it that make the whole thing kind of disappointing in certain aspects, but actually quite interesting in others. This is one of those games where the side stories and the individual characters are a lot more interesting than the actual main plotline itself. But the thing about all this moral choice and all that stuff is the game does the opposite of what games like this tend to do, by which I mean most games that have these big moral choices and stuff, they front load the really interesting stuff. So like, you know, the big defining choice happens near the beginning of the story and then it sort of peters out and becomes a lot less interesting later on. So you get stuff like, for instance, detonating the megaton bomb in Fallout 3, for instance, and some other things like that that are just like, you know, the things that are in the trailers, the big headlining choices that make all the news articles tend to be very early on in the story, and everything after that is a lot less interesting, but this game, in my opinion, does the exact opposite of that. The overall initial choices actually start out a lot less interesting than they become later, which is really weird, and instead of front-loading the interesting stuff, they backload it. And the first main area of the game, Old Villador, the place where you start, is actually the least interesting place in the whole game, both from a gameplay and a story standpoint, which is very odd for this sort of thing, because the moral choices start out a lot just way too obvious. You know, it's supposed to be kind of morally gray and not necessarily good versus evil in a post-apocalyptic survivalist sort of hellscape. It's not supposed to be that obvious. You know, if you want good moral choices, you have two factions at least that are both interesting and both have a good point and aren't necessarily one as good and one as evil for if you want to play the good or the evil character, right? It's not supposed to be that obvious. But the moral choices in this game start out that obvious. You have the peacekeepers who are treated as just this incredibly evil, corrupt organization of like authoritarian, almost fascists that just hate everything and are willing to kill innocents for no reason, and you have the Bazarians, which are just trying to survive. So your moral choices between the two are really not that complicated. It very much does boil down to these are kind of the good guys and these are kind of the bad guys, so depending on if you want to play a good or a bad guy, that's who you choose. So the initial choices are a lot less interesting, but once you get later into the game and you get closer to the city center, you get to the big metropolitan environments and stuff, it gets a lot less clear-cut and a lot more interesting than that. It gets very much less black and white and a lot more gray. In fact, I personally think that the story as a whole actually picks up once you get to the metropolitan area of the city, because it doesn't feel like the story is happening to you like it does at first, where you're just sort of caught up not knowing what to do and just sort of picking good or evil, and instead it feels like you're being more proactive, getting to know various characters and various factions and actually making a difference. So the game definitely backloads its most interesting content. And without wishing to spoil anything, the main storyline does get a little bit Resident Evil-y. Honestly, it's kind of an odd twist in the way that I just wasn't expecting it to go that particular direction, but it is relatively predictable outside of that, and it's an okay story. You know, it's nothing to write home about, but it does the job. It's not great, it's not awful either, it just sort of is there, but this is, like I mentioned earlier, a game where the individual characters' stories and the side stuff is a lot more interesting and engrossing than the main storyline itself. So I think that's part of the reason why it all feels like it picks up a lot once you start getting closer to the city center, because you're meeting a lot more characters and actually getting involved in a lot more conflicts and stuff, and like I said, it feels less like the story is happening to your character and more that your character actually cares about what's happening around them and is getting involved in it. On the topic of your character, his voice actor is extremely good, in my opinion. His voice is really, really nice, and I've only heard him in a couple of other places. Looking at his IMDb page, he's actually quite new to the whole voice acting thing. He's only been active for a couple of years, but he's got a pretty good future ahead of him, I feel, with a voice that good, and his overall delivery and performance in this game is really nice. He is probably one of the best voice acted, if not the best voice acted character in the game, with a really nice delivery of all the lines, and really believable emotional reads when they're appropriate, so it never just feels like he's reading off of a script. Unfortunately, some of the other characters really do fall flat in terms of the voice acting, with some of them being quite good, nearly up to par with the main character, and others just really not being very good at all. So these voice acting is very much a mixed bag in this game. What about the combat, since you're going to be doing that quite a lot? Well, the combat is marginally improved over Dying Light 1 in that it is still a very nice, chunky, impactful first-person combat system with a lot of fun moves, including, yes, the dropkick returns, the triumphant return of the dropkick, and it is just as fun to use this time around and fling enemies off of skyscrapers and stuff. Very enjoyable. But you also have several other moves, and in fact, really, the parkour is integrated into the combat a lot more this time around, with being able to vault off of staggered enemies and kick other enemies, or even vault around and like smash people from above and stuff like that. It adds a lot of verticality to the combat, which is nice. And this also makes the human enemies way more interesting to fight than they were in Dying Light 1. In the first game, you were mostly fighting zombies with the occasional human enemy, and they were kind of, I guess, sort of predictable. Their AI was not that complex, but in Dying Light 2, they've made them just better to fight in general, with a lot more variety and things they can use. You know, if you have, say, a ranged enemy with a bow, they'll actually stand back and find find high ground and shoot you from there, while their tanky enemies distract you and things of that nature. So they actually are a little bit smarter, and in combination with the various new moves and things that you have, fighting human enemies is now just as enjoyable as fighting zombies. Game mechanics wise, you've got all of the usual stuff here. You've got breakable weapons, of course, and you can of course upgrade all your various weapons in different aspects with different types of damage, from like shocking tips to flaming handles and other things like that, to make them do various types of damage. You can craft a very large variety of different things, from consumables to heal yourself, or to increase your immunity, which we'll talk about in a second, or to distract hordes of zombies with firecrackers and other things like that. You know, there's a large selection of things to craft, and a lot of different components for you to find around the world for this crafting. So this does make the exploration a lot more necessary, of course, because you do need to find the various tools and bits and bobs you need to make that Molotov cocktail or whatever you're looking to make. And of course there are lots of different opportunities around the map for you to find these things, from various dark zones, military convoys, and military parachute drops of supplies and some other things like that. So there's a good amount of stuff for you to explore and find in the open world, and this game does do its open world quite well in my opinion, because it is actually interesting to traverse. That's sort of the main difference between it and like your Far Cry's and your Assassin's Creeds and stuff, where a lot of the times it's just like a map that's just splattered with icons that you're meant to find. But in this case, because parkouring around the world is actually so enjoyable, it does make finding these things a lot more fun than in some more traditional open world settings. You can also find things like windmills that you can capture, and they allow electricity to flow in the general vicinity of them, so that you can find new faction buildings. And of course there are the moral choice faction building system things that allow you to divert electricity and some other things from substations and the like to one or the other factions, the survivors or the peacekeepers. And as you go up that faction's tree, you will get different benefits depending on who you choose for each thing. And there's really not a point in switching back and forth, because you get the best benefits from just doing all of them the same. So whichever one you choose at the beginning is probably going to be the one that you choose till the very end. Something that is new to this one, though, is the fact that you're actually infected with the virus yourself. You are at risk of becoming a zombo, so you actually have to be careful at night. You have an immunity meter that shows up whenever you're in darkness, either cloaked in the darkness of an enclosed building or actually when night falls. And this will give you a certain amount of time to get to light before you will just game over. You'll straight up die. So you have to be careful about how long you actually stay out at night, because you need to be aware of where the nearest UV lamps and stuff are to actually recharge your immunity. You can also carry things like UV shrooms, which restore a little bit of your immunity when eaten, or you can learn to craft these UV shrooms into inhalers that restore a lot more of your immunity, so you can take those along with you. Something about the crafting system is that you can actually upgrade the blueprints that you have, which is interesting. I don't normally see this system used, but the blueprints aren't just things that make an item. They're actually upgradable resources in and of themselves, and as you upgrade a blueprint, the item that it creates will also increase in tier, dealing more damage or healing you more or whatever it is that it does, sometimes using it faster and some other benefits. So you really want to upgrade your blueprints, because it makes a very big difference to the crafted items that you make from those blueprints. But the main resource for upgrading blueprints are things like trophies, which you get from killed zombies. So you do have to kill some of the more special infected and things to actually get access to some of these more unique trophies. So there's definitely a lot to do in this game. As far as all that goes, there's a lot of gameplay here. There's a lot to it. There's a lot of side quests for you to do. Oftentimes they are all voice acted and actually can sometimes have some interesting stories along with them as well, being just fun diversions. And of course there's all the stuff around the map for you to find and craft and upgrade and do. And all of your traversal methods can also be upgraded. So once you unlock things like the paraglider and eventually the grappling hook, you can improve these as well with some rare military tech around the place, and they definitely make getting around the world even more fun than already is. So I guess the real question is, are you ready for Dying Light another one? Is Dying Light 2 enough of a difference from the first one to actually interest you? In my opinion, it does everything that Dying Light 1 did just as well, but with a couple of extra little tweaks here and there. It is an improved game, but it's improved in small ways. There's nothing massively new or different here that makes it a big headlining feature. But in my opinion, it is a very fun game. Despite doing nothing new, it still does everything well enough to be very enjoyable. And just traversing around the map with the improved parkour mechanics and occasionally dropping in on a zombie and kicking it over the railing is still really, really fun, and is enough of a good time for me, even though some of these story beats get quite predictable and the overall moral choice system was just as overblown as we expected it to be. So that is my current view on Dying Light 2, a very fun game, even though it does pretty much nothing new at all. So thank you guys very much for watching. The link to the Steam store page will be in the description below this video if you would like to check this game out yourself. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.